Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back to Civics in a Year. Today we're talking about McCulloch versus Maryland. So another Supreme Court case from the 19th century. Dr. Beienberg is back with us. Dr. Beienberg, we're looking at this case from 1819 that's talking about the supremacy of the U.S. Constitution and federal laws over state laws. So what is McCulloch versus Maryland really about?
So McCulloch v. Maryland is part of a long-standing, multi-decade discussion over whether a bank of the United States is constitutional or not. So this is sort of the second of three, I guess I would say, maybe four, if we're counting sort of Tyler at the very end, sort of skirmishes in that long war. So the very, very beginning is effectively, does Congress, with its enumerated powers, have the right to charter a bank? And this is really what splits Madison and Hamilton at the founding. And it's easy in a sense to overstate the disagreements in some of this stuff. So effectively, in both the first Bank of the United States debate in the 1790s and then in McCulloch again, there's a question of, obviously everybody recognizes there is no power to just incorporate a bank, right? Jefferson, they all agree. Hamilton agrees with that. He concedes that very quickly. The question is incorporating a bank a necessary and proper technique to implement some of the other enumerated powers, particularly commerce and then raising, supporting armies and taxing and spending, right? And Jefferson takes, back in the day, a very, very strict, and I'm spending time on the first bank because McCulloch basically repeats all these.
Yes.
Jefferson says necessary and proper means the Congress can't do it unless that's the only effectively way that power could be implemented. And Hamilton, which Hamilton then correctly says, he's effectively adding the word absolutely before necessary, right? This is the absolutely necessary way to implement. We can't have a tax power without it. And so Hamilton is right in critiquing Jefferson there. Conversely, Hamilton wants to say effectively necessary and proper can be almost anything that's kind of like convenient or attached to. And so Jefferson can critique him and say, well, no, like your definition is really, really infinitely flexible, right? And so McCulloch v. Maryland, and so that bank, the first bank expires. Madison actually changes his mind, ironically, and says, empirically, I know that a bank is necessary and proper to these, because when it expired, I couldn't meaningfully do these things during the War of 1812. So like the proof is in the pudding. It's actually pretty necessary for us to be able to run these. So they recharter the Second Bank of the United States, and it gets attacked on constitutional grounds. Originally, the question is not, is a bank constitutional or not? It's a much more narrow question of, basically, Maryland wants to tax the bank, not because they want to destroy it, but because they want to scare up some revenue. If they're taxing other banks, they want to tax this bank too. And so there's a sense in which this case could be really narrow, which is this seemingly is Maryland sort of interfering with the federal government, doing something that if we think, as Madison had then said, a bank is a necessary and proper implementation of these other enumerated powers, then we have to do this, and this is interfering with it. Marshall gets critiqued. And for those who really want to dive into this, the best book analysis of this is by a scholar named Richard Ellis called Aggressive Nationalism. And effectively, when McCulloch comes down, there are not that many people who are really upset that a bank was upheld. The concern is that there's some language in McCulloch that is potentially very, very expansive in terms of its interpretation of power. Right? So the fact that McCulloch holds and lays out the idea that constitutional laws are supreme and trump state laws It lays it out very extensively. That part is not in itself particularly controversial. So McCulloch is important for that, but that part is not controversial. Even the critics, and one thing that's kind of a funny aside, McCulloch's opinion gets criticized in the press, and Marshall starts writing basically anonymous op-eds defending it and saying, like, here's what it really meant, because that brilliant John Marshall had these great thoughts. I just love the idea of like John Roberts like writing angry op-eds into the Washington Post today about how brilliant John Roberts is. But that's basically what John Marshall is doing. But if you read some of those critiques by James Madison or Spencer Roane, they're not that mad that a bank gets upheld. They have no problem with the idea that a federal law should trump a state law if that federal law is indeed authorized by the Constitution. So that's critically important. What they get upset about is that there's some language in McCulloch that both talks about the origins of the Union in ways that are sort of really weird and completely unnecessary. But there's also some language in there that sounds like Hamilton in terms of the necessary and proper clause. And there's also language in there that sounds like Madison in the necessary and proper clause, right? So McCulloch is a kind of choose your own adventure if you're thinking about it as a precedent. Because on the one hand, you can cite language that sounds very Hamiltonian, where he says necessary doesn't mean absolutely necessary. Jefferson is wrong. He says, we don't think that it means is an absolute physical necessity so strong that a thing can't exist without the other, right? Jefferson's wrong about that. And then he says, it sometimes means basically something that produces that end, something that is convenient or useful or essential. So that sounds kind of Hamilton and expansive. But then he goes on to say that the powers of the government are limited and sound construction requires that all means which are appropriate and plainly adapted to that end, right? So they can't just be a pretext where we want a bank and so we're just going to point at something and call it a day, right? So, later courts, you can point at McCulloch and say, this means the necessary and proper clause is almost anything goes, or this means the necessary and proper clause isn't a pretext for any random thing that Congress wants to do. Marshall tends to write in very, very sweeping, kind of almost political speech-like language, which is how he can get drafted into something later. So, like, everybody's going to point at McCulloch, in the 20th century and say, it's on my team. Mm-hmm. But fundamentally, it lays out the case for federal law being supreme over state law if it's a constitutionally authorized, which he goes through and explains that it is. So that's sort of its major thing. It sometimes gets described as like coming up with the idea of implied powers. Again, that's not something that was something people are talking about. That's something that the Federalist Papers talk about, where Madison says the necessary and proper clause really doesn't do anything because the powers are already effectively implied. So, like with Marbury, it's the case where the court is really laying out the logic for these kinds of things. And so it's establishing it in that sense, but it's not like coming up with the idea that there are implied powers that are necessary to implement the enumerated powers. Again, it's worth emphasizing that implied powers, even in Hamilton's formulation, always has to go back to the enumerated, to an enumerated power implementation. He might be a little more freewheeling in how tight that connection has to be than others are. So Marshall is trying, in a sense, to be closer to Madison's views in 1790 than either Jefferson, which is ultra strict, or Hamilton, which is very, very expansive and capacious. But it depends on which.
Go on. So a lot of these earlier cases, though, are just like this is like the Constitution now in practice and really trying to interpret for future generations and set a precedent for what this means.
Yeah, I would say in some sense it's defining and explaining as much as anything else, right? So it's not there's not a court precedent for some of this stuff earlier because it's early cases, right? Like so, I mean, the Supreme Court really is not taking very many cases early on in its history. They start taking a whole ton, in the 19th century, or later in the 19th century. So yeah, Marshall is trying to effectively explain and lay out some of this stuff. And again, he's a good writer. Sometimes he can write sort of things that you can pull at it in either direction because his writing style is his writing style is majestic in the sense that it reads like a political speech more than really, really boring. It's why he's it's partly why he gets cited so much. It's because it's really quotable, right? We must never forget is the Constitution, big capital letters we are expounding. Well, what does that actually mean, though, right? So, in a way that, well, commerce means blah, 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 right? So, McCulloch is controversial when it comes down, less for its result, because people are not that worked up about a bank on the whole. Jackson and his faction still are, but more for the language that some of the critics point, I think, correctly to say there's some real flowery language in here that can get used in some strange ways later. And indeed that happens, during the 20th century as they're expanding the Commerce Clause, they'll point to McCulloch and pick out those little quotes that effectively say it's anything that's convenient, ignoring but it has to actually be a meaningful connection and not basically a pretext.
Yes, and I feel like that's going to be the perfect segue into our next episode, kind of a little bit on the Commerce Clause, but really looking at Gibbons v. Ogden. Dr. Beienberg, thank you.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.